I lost my mother to the pandemic, not in flesh, not in blood, but in spirit. 3 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with dementia, which turned out to be Alzheimer's. It's a diagnosis that withers a family, dismantles its hopes of happiness into smithereens. I knew exactly what awaited my mother, a psychological limbo. When the doctor said that medicines couldn't stop the cognitive decline, my sole objective in life was to make her present, the only shred of certainty she was clinging on to as a mortal, as happy and bearable as possible. Keeping that in mind, in February 2020, I hosted an elaborate bash for my parents' 45th marriage anniversary. "Do you think we will not live to see the 50th? My mother joked. I wasn't so sure. I still remember that day when she couldn't recognize many who had come to join the celebrations. But she was happy and jubilant. And that's all that mattered, because happiness was the only prescription to making Alzheimer's bearable to us as a family. In my mind, I had decided to fly down to Delhi every 2 months just to be able to spend time with my mother before her mind completely descended into void. 2 months later, my mother was condemned to house arrest. She wasn't alone. COVID-19 did it to the elderly the world over. As India imposed strictest possible lockdown to contain the spread of the novel coronavirus, my mother would have to find her world at home. This at a moment when the doctors had advised her to let her socialize more. Alzheimer's wasn't the only demon Mum was fighting. It was also years of untreated depression. She needed to be out and about in order to discover and distract herself. If there was any hope of that, the lockdown turned out to be the final nail on the coffin. My family began to witness a sharp decline in her attention spans that had already shortened over the years. She found herself lost in her own home. Staying in an indefinite period of confinement, she even forgot her partner of 45 years, my father. She suffered hallucinations and mourned the death of a husband who was very much alive. My brother became her only connect with the present. Staying in Dubai and caught up in the rigors of a job, I was oblivious to the final descent that had already begun. My father's standing instructions to all family members was not to tell me about the exact nature of the deterioration. This was his way of protecting me, even if it meant casually lying that she was all right. The truth, the dark truth, revealed itself to me on the day of Diwali. As I called to wish my family, my brother seemed particularly reluctant to talk to me. He would insist I speak to my father. It wasn't until I pressed him for the reasons that he told me about the rapidly worsening nature of my mother's Alzheimer's. Within a week, I took a flight and went to meet my mother. She wasn't around when I reached my residence, so I waited anxiously about what was to unfold. As the doorbell rang, I got up and opened the door, and I was relieved to see my mother with my uncle. Thank God she looks all right, or so I thought. She entered the room and sat next to me. I thought we would be sharing a mother-daughter moment. But then she touched my hand and asked, "What's your name, beta?" Today, my memories of my time with my mother are neatly compartmentalized into the time before and after this moment. In the time before, she had been a woman who had expectations from her life. She wanted to visit England, something I kept planning every year fruitlessly. Having a sweet tooth, she learnt baking. She wanted to run after grandchildren who were yet to be born. And somewhere, in the middle of this daydreaming, a nightmare was unfolding. As someone who was not living this nightmare day in and day out, I felt obliged to put out a strong front. It didn't mean that I would resort to assuring my family that mom would be fine. Rather, it meant working towards creating a system that would make my mother's life with Alzheimer's easier. This meant making notes for her to remember things, putting small notes with her name and address in her purse if she were to ever forget where she lives. The world loves the idea of a strong woman till adversity hits and challenges our resilience. My strength came from looking at the silver linings. My mother was still alive during a pandemic that had already claimed several lives. But if there was one thing I prayed for, it was for COVID to stay away from my family. What we fear most also has a way of turning into reality. COVID entered my household in April this year. It was a time when Delhi was exasperated. There was shortage of oxygenated beds, proper medical care wasn't easily available. In our household, Alzheimer's and COVID turned out to be a heady concoction. Not knowing that she's infected, my mother would reach out to the nurse who had been appointed for her. And fearing that my mom would infect her, the nurse left soon after. If my mom's oxygen levels were dipping at an alarming rate and she had to be hospitalized, I feared who would take her. The rest of the family, after all, were already weak and bedridden. There were many good Samaritans who would volunteer, but could a woman who experiences hallucinations remain in company of strangers in PPE gear? There was no light at the end of this tunnel. Mom eventually recovered. It took a lot of help from friends, whether it was having food delivered at our home or getting medicines and arranging concentrators. But all this came at a cost. My mother went deeper into her hallucinations. Apparently, a medicine prescribed for COVID interfered with her Alzheimer's medication. And though the doctors were divided on this, we definitely, as family members, noticed a steep decline in her cognitive prowess. But we also had little choice but to accept what was happening to our mother. I have lived through much of this period as a spectator, living in another country. What has hit hard was the knowledge of my mother's mortality. In the time of crisis, we seek faith because scientific facts don't appeal to the heart. Moreover, the human mind does not accept that life comes to an end. We create ideas like afterlife to convince ourselves that something of our loved ones will be retained. It won't be. I had gone through all stages of grief when COVID hit my family and transported me back to denial. It was yet another reminder of my mother's limited time on the planet. I needed closure that would not come so easily. And then I thought, what does closure even mean during a pandemic? This is an alienating virus. It demands that we live in our silos and interact with people virtually. This is a consolation we give ourselves every time we experience loss. We are collectively in a limbo. But for people like me, this limbo has an additional baggage to it, that of survivor's guilt. I often wonder, what am I really guilty of? The knowledge that I escaped the nightmare that my brother and father lived through every day of their lives? The knowledge that I might just be experiencing moments of happiness at a time when my mother is hallucinating? I survive while my family simply exists. This is what my conscience tells me every day. What is this survivor's guilt that I'm talking about? A basic internet search will tell you that it is a mental health condition where a person believes that they have committed a sin by surviving a trauma that others couldn't. The way I see it, it is the mind's way of acquainting you with your privilege, while also undoing yourself at the same time. I have often thought about how I have survived the survivor's guilt by looking the other way. This has meant burying my head into work, sometimes even inventing work for myself so there's no room to think. If this has meant fewer phone calls back home, so be it. But survivor's guilt hits the hardest when you have empty moments in your life, those moments when you have nothing to do but think. I fear these empty moments because inadvertently the image of my mother comes in my head. The knowledge that I might be abandoning her in her time of need. I can probably blame the COVID-related travel risks for my increasingly infrequent visits to Delhi. But in my heart, I know that this is not the case. So then, is survivor's guilt also the mind's way of being hard on yourself? Even if so, I have seen it as penance. Waking up every single morning to numb myself to a sense of loss. That has been my way of coping with my mom's cognitive decline. In the context of COVID-19, we tend to associate survivor's guilt with those who have experienced loss in more tangible terms, death. But there are many of us who continue to experience this constant state of loss. Actually, come to think of it, when was the last time we experienced devastation at this scale? While the world has changed on one hand, the terms on which it operates have not. Money still buys us good life, which sometimes means as little as affording best treatment should things go wrong for our loved ones. For those who are employed, work from home has meant longer working hours. And given how the pandemic has impacted various sectors, we are also living with a constant sense of dispensability. If in pre-pandemic times we could simply pack our bags and go anywhere in the world to recharge ourselves, we can't do so anymore, especially because many countries have imposed travel restrictions. When it started, we romanticized lockdowns as a much-needed pause we needed from our lives, from our daily lives. But in this new normal, where individuals are so easily replaceable, we have also been denied a basic coping strategy: distraction. What can possibly distract you when COVID dominates living room and water cooler conversations? Somebody or the other is experiencing loss, reminding us of the threat that is lurking in our own backyard. Every day is about picking up the pieces and starting afresh. And as this virus mutates, we are experiencing burnouts, anxiety, a sense of languishing, and we are also there is a sense of urgency in naming these feelings that we have not felt before, because it gives us a false sense of being in control. The fact is, we aren't. I have often tried to dissect the origins of this grief and guilt I have been experiencing, to understand how the virus has not only changed lives, but also transformed people. The New York Times sent its reporters to Bergamo province in Italy. It was in Bergamo that hospitals became makeshift morgues. Scenes of absolute devastation gave us a peek into the horrors that the virus could wreak. In a detailed report, NYT discovered that people who had lost their loved ones to COVID-19 here had diametrically opposite reactions to the crisis. Some wanted to be left alone because the virus had pushed them to it, while others sought company, fearing this loneliness. There was anger against the government for letting the situation go out of hand. There was anger against gods too. Every emotion was underlined by a survivor's guilt. And this survivor's guilt had changed the very fabric of people's lives. It had turned them to substance and alcohol. And this, I suspect, is happening the world over, where people have experienced loss in some form or the other. While it is an emotional state of being, survivor's guilt manifests itself through depression and anxiety, both of which have been rising steadily ever since the pandemic began. A study conducted by Columbia School of Public Health noted that the cases of clinical depression and anxiety have increased by 21 and 24%. In Asia, this figure is rounded off at 18%, roughly. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 13 globally suffers from anxiety. I happen to be one of them. I have lived with clinical anxiety for most part of my life. And then there are 264 million people all over the world who suffer from depression. Imagine what enduring loss during a pandemic has meant for people like us. It hasn't been easy. They say the wound is the place from which light enters you. That light entered into my life 1 year after my mother asked for my name, and it entered in the form of therapy and writing. Going through my own grief, I began to write about my mother's condition, only to see it resonate widely. I remember the first time I wrote about my mother's battle with Alzheimer's. I feared that writing would invite stigma that is so often associated with mental health patients, even though Alzheimer's is a neurological condition. But above all, it was also opening personal wounds to a public that I would never see or meet. But what writing did for me was that it articulated the journey that my mind was going through. This sweet spot between acceptance and reconstruction was discovered by me thanks to a therapist who chose to show me the larger picture. With her, I embarked on a journey to understand my own mind and realize that while grief is personal, it is also universal. We are all experiencing it. I also confronted that thought that I had buried in the subconscious. I was never having it as easy as I thought. It also took immense courage to get up day after day and just carry on with life. You see, sometimes survival itself takes courage. Once I reached this point of realization, it was easy to rationalize a few things. And what I learned during this journey is that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is healing, beginning a constructive dialogue with our minds and talking back to that voice that deems us guilty of survival. Our salvation lies in this conversation with ourselves.